Okay, good morning, and welcome to the very British weather that we have today. I hope you're all suitably sodden. I shall try to enliven you, or at least you might dry out by the end of the class. Today is basically a lecture about popular culture in the 19th century. But before I get going, I wanted to just explain where it fits in the class as a whole. The last few lectures, we've been exploring a sort of range of changes that occurred during the 19th century, and perhaps especially in the decades between the 1840s and the 1880s. And I've been suggesting to you that these changes have been caused by a variety of forces that I've characterized as broadly liberal, with a small l in their conception, and forces that transform the practice of economic life, of representative politics, and of the nature of life for women and for the family. And in all those areas, there have been two things that I've been trying to emphasize. One is that they've caused the erosion of customary and local forms of social and economic organisation, and put in their place, slowly and gradually, but put in their place a series of sort of national or standardised forms that were deemed to be both more rational and more moral. Okay? The second point that I've been trying to draw out in these lectures is that these new forms of social and economic organisation were intended to produce a new type of person, what I've described as a sort of ideal liberal subject, a new type of person. And what characterised that new person was having a sound moral character that enabled them to govern themselves and their families. So today, we're basically going to look at a very similar process, but in the realm of popular culture, and we're going to look at the transition from the sort of customary culture that was predominantly local and unorganised to, and ones that reformers characterised as irrational and immoral and disorderly, to forms of popular culture that were national in scope, that were increasingly commodified, i.e. made commercial, and took increasingly organised sort of bureaucratic or institutional forms. What I'm going to be suggesting to you today is that by 1914, by the outbreak of the First World War, we have something that looks recognisable to us, even in 21st century California, as a modern mass culture. A modern mass culture with three key characteristics: a clear division between work and leisure, a separation of the realms of work and leisure time, specific new spaces for the practice of leisure, and increasingly national and indeed imperial forms of popular culture. And we can think of that in terms of things like the cinema, but I'm going to talk to you mainly about organised sport. Now, of course, by this time in the class, you will have learnt that these changes that I've been talking about across these series of areas were never linear. They never happened straightforwardly. And rather like electoral culture, popular culture was changed, but it also changed in ways that showed distinct forms of continuity from the earlier forms that were trying to be displaced by the new forms, and that they also created new types of traditions that we now think of as having existed for a long time, but in fact were a product of the second half of the 19th century. There are two important points that I want you to take out of this lecture and out of this account of the process of the transformation of popular culture. The first is that popular culture becomes less a space of active participation than one which is commercialised and becomes predicated around a new type of what I'm going to describe as a culture of spectatorship. So it's something that you watch, you observe, rather than something that you necessarily actively produce. The second point is that these new forms of popular culture dramatise the assumptions about how an individual was meant to conduct themselves. And basically what I'm going to be suggesting to you today is that popular culture created new disciplines of leisure. Having fun and pleasure was now not a straightforward thing. It came with a set of assumptions about how one should enjoy oneself. So, one big issue that we're going to be trying to work out today is how we get there. How do we get from this local, customary-based popular culture to one that looks recognisably modern? And I'm going to suggest that there are basically four key forces of reform leading to these changes. The first is the importance of moral reform, the promotion of new forms of moral and rational forms of recreation. And that's a continuation of the story that we began to see in with the evangelical revival in the 18th century. The second is the new work disciplines created by the consolidation of industrial capitalism, most notably the creation of a settled working day, working week, and working year, and the idea that leisure was now going to be something that helped recreate the worker. The third area is what I'm going to describe as the commodification of pleasure, the development of new commercial forms of mass entertainment that create this culture of spectatorship. And then finally, I'm going to be suggesting that a key influence upon these changes was imperialism and the impact of immigration, of the beginning of a more diverse form of popular culture reflected in leisure pursuits. So let me very quickly recap about the nature of customary culture that was to be displaced. And here I'm just going to gesture back very briefly to the lecture that I gave you on the Enlightenment and 18th century civil society, where you'll remember I used this image by Hogarth of a cockfight. And we talked about the ways in which moral reformers and Enlightenment scholars sought to understand this customary culture as both immoral and irrational. It was a double whammy. It was both immoral and irrational. And you saw this very clearly in your reading of John Brand's observations on popular antiquities in 1777, where you remember he tried to record the range of customary pursuits in Britain in order to be able to distinguish between those customs that should be continued and those which should be lost to history. So today, your reading is from William Hone's Everyday Book, published in 1825. And you'll see there's a slight difference in the tone between William Hone and John Brand. William Hone was a radical publisher. He was continually bankrupt, continually being pursued by the authorities. And his everyday book sought to provide an almanac of the year, organized around different customs on every day of the year. And as I told you on that lecture on the 18th century, civil society almanacs were a very, very popular and increasingly commercial genre that publishers used to, as an income generator. Now, the key points that you need to remember about this customary culture is, as I said, that they're immoral and irrational, that they seem to be based upon local forms of organization, local and oral forms of communication. They were traditions handed down orally in local communities. That they were seen to be collective and unruly, as in this Hogarth image, and that they were characterized by all the things that rational reformers and moral reformers thought were bad. That is, liberal supplies of alcohol, violence and cruelty, in this case cruelty to animals, and gambling. The other point that I didn't emphasize in the earlier lecture, that I'm just going to gesture to here because it becomes important later on, is that the other key feature of this customary culture is that it was predicated on there not being a clear separation between work and leisure. Okay? That there wasn't a clear pattern to the organisation of the working day, or the working week, or indeed the working year. And these things were negotiated basically between workers and their masters, or in the case of household forms of production, between the family and the patriarch. All of this is going to look very different very soon. And one of the key reasons why that is the case is the continuing influence of moral reform and the development of new forms of rational recreation. Don't you love this image of the drunkard's coat of arms? Alcohol is a big theme of this lecture. If I was kind, I would have bought it in a keg of beer so that you could have enjoyed it in the proper spirit. What was that? It would? Well, maybe. Actually, I can't because most of you are under 21, and I would get into trouble. Yeah, if this could become a little pocket of the UK for the space of an hour and a half, I could freely supply you with alcohol. But alas, we're in Berkeley. Okay, so let's move to this, to the return to the world of the evangelical revival. Key part of what I'm going to be suggesting to you here is that the evangelical revival that sort of breathed new life, not just into the Anglican Church, but into religious practice generally in the 18th century, had a very long shadow in the 19th century. And one of the reasons, particularly in the Anglican community, was that many of the fears that Anglicans had in the 18th century continue to be evident in the 19th century. There was a continuing concern that the Anglican Church had lost its grip as the source of moral authority upon the growing and increasingly urban population. Indeed, in many ways, the understanding of secularization, of the emptying out of religion from the practice of social life, didn't just come from the Enlightenment. It didn't just come from the progression of enlightened rational thought, and it didn't just culminate in Darwin's victory of science over divinity in the middle of the 19th century. It came as much, I'm going to suggest, from the Church and its dissenting critics, who were worried about the deeply irreligious nature of the working poor. So one of the things that they tried to do to try and spread the word of God to these seemingly irreligious people outside the influence of the Church was to build new churches, to take the Church into particularly the new urban spaces that had grown up so quickly in the late 18th and 19th centuries. So between 1770 and 1830, there were almost 49,000 new places of worship built. 49,000 new places of worship built in just 60 years. And most worryingly for the Anglican community, just 5% of those, a little under 2,300, were Anglican churches. So the vast majority of those were from the dissenting or nonconformist communities. We can think of this in terms of the spread of congregational chapels, Baptist chapels, Methodist chapels, etc. In fact, there were 3.5 times as many congregational chapels built as Anglican churches, 4 times more Baptist churches, and 14 times more Methodist chapels than Anglican churches. So the Anglicans, concerned about their receding grip upon the urban population, resolved to try and build new churches. And there was even a society called the Church Building Society, a rather unnovel name for its purpose, which successfully lobbied for 2 new church building acts in Parliament, first in 1818 and then in 1824. And these acts provided about £1.5 million for the construction of new churches. And there were 2,000 new Anglican churches built between 1831 and 1851. By 1918, there had been 4,000 new Anglican churches built. So this is an area of energetic attempts by religious communities to build new places of worship in the industrializing and urbanizing communities. In many ways, the worst fears of these communities were realized in the census of 1851, where there was a religious census held on a Sunday, which discovered, alarmingly for many contemporaries, that 60% of the population did not attend any place of worship on that Sunday. And even more concerning for the Anglican community, 50% of the people attending church were not Anglicans. And to confirm their worst fears, it was decisively shown that the majority of non-worship were the urban working class, the precise people over which the church sought to have a form of moral government. In fact, in the cities like London, attendance fell as low as 20%, and that really didn't change for much of the 20th century. There's another survey conducted in 1902 that shows pretty much the same rates of non-attendance in London. And yet, religion continued to be a central fact of life for many people. And it did so in 3 ways. First was the influence of moral reform and the sort of practice of everyday life. Remember how the evangelical revival had sought to generalize the war against sin, to see sin that was everywhere, and to remind everyone that they had to work hard on the salvation of their soul, and the good forms of moral practice that would help save themselves. So moral reform, as we'll see in a moment, becomes very generalized. Secondly, religion becomes deeply politicized in the 19th century in new ways. You'll remember that the Testing Corporations Act had basically banned nonconformists, Catholics and nonconformists from holding public office. That was finally repealed in 1829. You'll remember also that those nonconformists had to pay church rates for the maintenance of the local Anglican church, even though they were not members of those congregations. That was made voluntary in 1853. And finally abolished in 1868. It was a big part of nonconformist political agitation in the middle of the 19th century, trying to remove the burden of church rates. And finally, education provided an area in which religion became highly politicized, in part because of the creation of national education. State provided national education in 1870, with children, in 1870 and 1880, it was made compulsory for children to attend school for the first time. But also by opening up the ancient universities to non-Anglicans. The Universities Test Acts of 1871 finally opened up Oxford and Cambridge to non-Anglicans. Finally, religion remains important because even though people weren't frequently attending church, it remained the key way in which individuals marked the rites of passage of their life, of getting married, of being baptized, and of being buried. I mean, cremation does begin to develop in the 19th century, but the vast majority of people continue to be buried in churchyards. So up to 1914, 90% of marriages are conducted in places of worship, and so are 75% of baptisms. And indeed, there's some evidence to show that the peak attendance in places of worship was in 1904. So the peak attendance in terms of the numbers of people attending was in 1904, but you have to remember that the size of the population had grown so dramatically that doesn't work as a proportion of the population as a whole. So all of that is to slightly qualify the stereotypical account that basically religion is over by the time that Darwin publishes The Origin of the Species in 1859. It's certainly true that for much of the 18th and early 19th century, science and religion had been seen to be not mutually incompatible. Indeed, William Paley's Natural Theology in 1801 is a great example of that, where the scientific observation of nature showed for Paley that nature unfolded to God's divine plan. So that there wasn't necessarily an opposition coming out of the Enlightenment between religion and science. It's also the case that many people before Darwin began to think that nature actually had its own internal laws of development that could not be explained by forces of divine forces. And it's also the case that even after Darwin, many people try and combine the practice of science and religion. Okay? And in many ways, the best example of that is the proliferation of new forms of spiritualism in the late 19th century, where people try and do scientific experiments on human consciousness and the limits of the spirit. I want to just say a little more here about the ways in which moral and rational reform came to structure the understanding of personal life, and I'm going to do it through this figure that you see behind me of Samuel Smiles, the first guru of self-help, and a very un-Californian type of self-help guru he was, as you'll see. The point that I want to make here is that the question of moral government, of the moral government of one's behaviour, exceeded the practice of religion. That moral reform became generalised and separated simply from the practice of religion. Indeed, in some ways, some historians have suggested that moral reform became a type of secular religion in the 19th century. A secular religion that championed this idea of moral character, of the individual developing sound forms of moral character. And a key part of the new types of popular culture we're going to be looking at in a moment was that these new forms of leisure were designed to promote sound moral character. They were meant to be both moral and rational in form, because leisure was increasingly linked to this idea of rational recreation, of recreation being about self-improvement and the development of strong and sound moral character. Now, you can see by the title of Smiles's books here, between 1859 and 1880, what sound moral character would look like. It wasn't a lot of fun. And his books basically charted the ways in which you could develop this sense of character through self-improvement and self-help. And a key thing that you should know immediately is that this was primarily a masculine endeavour. Smiles was primarily concerned with how men became respectable, moral, and rational. You have a reading from this week of Smiles' self-help, and I'm just going to remind you of the very first paragraph that you have to read, just because I think it's always instructive to learn from the great gurus of self-help. The object of the book, he writes briefly, is to reinculcate these old-fashioned but wholesome lessons, which perhaps cannot be too often urged, that youth must work in order to enjoy. Remember that. Youth must work in order to enjoy. That nothing creditable can be accomplished without application and diligence. That the student must not be daunted by difficulties, but conquer them by patience and perseverance. That above all, he must seek elevation of character, without which capacity is worthless and worldly success is naught. If the author has not succeeded in illustrating these lessons, he can only say that he has failed in his object. Now, the key part of Samuel's ideas, of Smiles's ideas of self-help and self-improvement, is that it required inculcating new habits of personal development, new habits, new practices of self-realization and recreation, recreating oneself. That was the point of leisure, to recreate oneself in more moral and rational ways. And while Smiles would not